Ladies, gentlemen, friends, colleagues, thank you so much for joining us today at the National Museum of the United States Army. Our program today, Battle Brief, Battle of the Wilderness, 1864, is presented by Dr. John Maass, who is a member of the education team at the National Museum. I'm going to hand the program over to him to give us the fascinating, in-depth history of the Battle of the Wilderness.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone, to the Civil War Week of the National Museum of the U.S. Army. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm John Maass. I work at the museum. And today, as part of our Civil War Week, we are going to be talking about the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864, early May. So I want to encourage you to use the Q&A function for any questions that you might want to ask for later in the program, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We appreciate you joining us today. Our theme for the week is Civil War military leadership. So in this presentation, we're going to be sticking kind of pretty much at the high end of the command structure. So mostly Army commanders and Corps commanders, because the time's just not going to allow us to get too much into the fine details. But hopefully this will be a great starting point for you if you're not familiar with the battle, to be able to read on some more. And those of you who know a good bit about the wilderness, you'll recognize some of the maps I've got for us and some of the images. So there's two reasons why we chose the wilderness for a discussion today on our Civil War Week. And one of them is the fact that this was the first battle where General U.S. Grant, if we can go to the next slide, General U.S. Grant, who was recently appointed Lieutenant General of the Union Armies, joined Army of the Potomac Commander, which you see on the right, George Gordon Meade. And this has been traditionally portrayed as Lee versus Grant, Grant versus Lee, in books and titles and articles and that. But really, as we heard last night, if you were with us on our book talk last night with John Selby about General Meade, General Meade was still very much the commander of the Army of the Potomac, but Grant decided to take the field with the Army, and so this is really the first time he's involved with active operations in the Eastern Theater. And of course, as most of you know, the other factor was the terrain. The terrain was very difficult. This was an area that had been clear-cut for decades prior to the Civil War to support the wood needed for the local iron furnaces and the iron industry. And second growth timber had come up, everything from weeds, brambles, fallen trees, branches. It made for an environment that was very difficult to see through, find your way, issue commands. So it's one of the most of the difficult terrains that we encounter during the Civil War. On the next slide, I'll show you here that we have the map of where the wilderness is and what the overall campaign was going to be about. Most of the Union Army was focused in the area of Culpeper Courthouse over the winter of 1863, 1864, whereas Lee's army was spread out, wintering from the area from Orange Courthouse down to Gordonsville and a little bit beyond Gordonsville on the way towards Charlottesville along the railroad. And you can see the arrow points to just over the Rapidan River, where the Union Army crossed primarily at two fords, Ely's Ford and Germanna Ford. And they were hoping to move towards Spotsylvania Courthouse through the wilderness and get out more into the open country around Spotsylvania and point south so that they could battle the smaller Confederate Army in the open fields rather than in the difficult terrain of the woods where Union Army's superiority in numbers, which was almost twice, not quite, would not matter as much. So here you can see basically where the action was focused. And by this time, and we'll go to the next slide, the Union Army was divided into several corps. And the key corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac were from left to right: Hancock of the Second Corps, Sedgwick of the Sixth Corps, and General Warren of the Fifth Corps. And these folks had been with the Army of the Potomac going way back. They had all been at all been at Gettysburg, July of 1863, all been at Chancellorsville, and various other battles when they were more junior ranking under McClellan and other commanders. So these were experienced commanders. And in addition, we can go to the next slide. It was a fourth corps under Major General Ambrose Burnside. And Burnside had been commander of the Army of the Potomac already. And he was the commander of the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, which was largely disastrous for the Union Army because of the assaults on Lee's position. He was removed from command after the first of the year in favor of Joseph Hooker. But because of his previous position and his date of rank, he actually outranked Meade, who was commander of the Army of the Potomac. So there had to be a working relationship where Meade wasn't giving orders directly to Burnside, but the relationship and the structure had to be that the Ninth Corps under Burnside was able to contribute meaningfully to the Army's operations. So there became a system where Grant would primarily issue the orders to Burnside that came through Meade, which was a little sticky in some ways. And Burnside's reputation was also that of somebody who really wasn't all that quick to move and to support other corps in the field. So it did become a sticking point. I will point out that if you would be interested, our Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern, our program will be Frank O'Reilly of the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park talking about the military career of Ambrose Burnside. So you can register for that on our website if you're interested in that one. So these were the corps commanders that the Federals were working with their troops. They had about 115,000 men, including cavalry under General Sheridan. So their goal again was to try to move from Culpeper across the Rapidan down through the wilderness before encountering Lee and move into the open country below, being south of the wilderness, so that Lee's numbers would be insufficient to win a victory against Meade and Grant, who was with Meade's headquarters. So if we go to the next slide, this map here shows you the intended routes and the routes that the Union Army took, and also the Confederate reaction. And we'll get to the Confederates in a minute here, but you can see over the top of your map, the Union Army is crossing the Rapidan at two fords, Germanna Ford and Ely's Ford. And they're moving, Hancock and the Second Corps, moving toward the old battlefield of Chancellorsville in order to go south towards Spotsylvania Courthouse, which you can see on the bottom right of your map. Sedgwick and Warren, you can see by this time on May 4th, Warren has crossed the river and has taken up a position at Wilderness Tavern. That crossroads there, many of you know, is where Route 20 heads off from Route 3 west of the Chancellorsville Visitor Center. It's starting to get built up a little bit, and that's where the Walmart was intended for that intersection, but thanks to the preservation efforts of groups like the American Battlefield Trust and the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust, the Walmart was built farther west along what's labeled here the Germanna Plank Road, but is today Virginia State Route 3. Now, you can see on the right of your map in the red circles where Lee's 3 corps were and how they advanced. So Lee, he was not going to get into a situation where he was going to allow the Union Army to cross the river, go through difficult terrain, and emerge into more open country without dealing them some kind of a blow. So we'll get to their corps commanders in a second here, but I just want to point out that there were 2 avenues of approach from Lee's position toward where Grant and his Army of the Potomac were moving south. So on the Orange Turnpike, which is the northernmost road that goes through Locust Grove, you can see on your map, was Ewell's 2nd Corps. And below them on a plank road, the Orange Plank Road, which ran south for a lot of the time toward Chancellorsville, the second attack coming through, or the second group of troops moving toward the positions of the Union Army in the wilderness, was A.P. Hill's corps, minus one of his divisions, which would join later, that under Richard H. Anderson. So you can see on the map here, both of those oblong circles represent the marching corps, the 2nd Corps under Ewell, and the 3rd Corps under A.P. Hill, moving through these woods. Now these woods from most of this area, except for some scattered farms in the area, were largely wooded. So there were some roads coming through here, and these are the avenues of approach that Lee needed to use. On this map, by the way, shows 1864 roads and not modern ones, just to be clear on that. So you can see on the bottom left where it says Longstreet, that was Longstreet coming up from Gordonsville, and he had farther to move along the way, but he would eventually arrive on the 2nd morning of the battle. So let's move to the next slide. And you can see this is an image of Robert E. Lee, full general of the Confederate Army. He was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he had taken over command during the 7 days battles of the Peninsula Campaign in 1862 under, 1862, excuse me. And Lee had gained by this time, as most of you know, an outstanding reputation as an Army commander. His only 2 setbacks or defeats were at Antietam in 1862, where his invasion had to turn back in Maryland, and of course the Battle of Gettysburg, where he had faced Meade from July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. But he was known as being audacious, looking for ways to be on the offensive, to attack if at all possible, but also to defend Virginia. He was a native Virginia, as most of you know, longtime U.S. Army officer prior to the Civil War, had been offered the command of the Union Army in 1861 by the commander-in-chief back then, which was Winfield Scott, declined that because he did not want to invade or attack or be fighting against his native state of Virginia. And the Lee family goes back into the 18th century. His father was Henry Lee III, known as Light Horse Harry, a genuine war hero of the Revolutionary War. And so Lee was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia at this time, and would be, of course, as most of you know, through the Confederate surrender at Appomattox in April 1865. Now, Lee had some very interesting individuals as his corps commanders. So let's move on to the next slide, and we'll look at these folks here. We've seen 4 Union Corps commanders. After the death of Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville, which is right near the Wilderness Battlefield, part of the Park Service, National Park Service lands there. Jackson died when there were 2, and he was a corps commander of the Second Corps. Longstreet, who you see on the left, was the commander of the First Corps. That's James Longstreet, born in South Carolina. At the time, after Jackson's death, Lee rearranged the divisions into 3 corps. The First Corps under Longstreet, again on your left. The Second Corps under General Richard S. Ewell, who is in the center there. And the third one on the right under General A.P. Hill. All of these men here had gone to West Point, served in the Mexican War, and had quite an extensive experience prior to the beginning of the campaign in 1864 in the Wilderness and Beyond, which is known as the Overland Campaign. So these were the men that Lee was relying on, particularly Longstreet. He had a relationship with Longstreet going back several years, but this is who he relied on for his operations. And again, as I said, Longstreet, his corps had been in the East Tennessee theater for quite a while. In the end of 1863, they fought at the Battle of Chickamauga in Georgia, operations against Knoxville, Tennessee, which had been commanded by none other than Ambrose Burnside, who was now back at the Wilderness. And Longstreet's men had wintered farther south so that they could spread out the Confederate troops and not tax their logistical system as extensively. But by this time, he had been brought up for the spring campaign that Lee anticipated. Okay, so these were the commanders, both north and south, that you can see here. And most of these names are pretty familiar to folks who read about and study the Civil War. Now, let's go to the next slide, and we'll start to get into what happened as far as the battle. The battle lasted 2 days for the most part. The May 5th was day 1, and May 6th, day 2. And it was in roughly the same terrain, so there was quite a lot of action, quite a lot of casualties along these lines. And what you see here on the beginning of the first day is that the Federals had come, and Hancock was in the lead, heading toward Todd's Tavern and Spotsylvania Courthouse. That's where they were aiming for. He was followed by Warren and then Sedgwick. General Burnside was still on the other side of the Rapidan River, coming up eventually. But they developed the battle on these 2 roads, the Orange Turnpike on the north and the Orange Plank Road on the south. The first fighting developed on the north, where you see Ewell versus Warren and Sedgwick. So when the Federals were coming through this area on the 4th and the 5th, by the time of the 5th, they had discovered that Lee's force was coming at them. And Warren's troops could see down the Orange Turnpike that there were some cavalry scouts, but a lot of infantry. And he reported that back to Meade. So Warren was deployed out the Orange Turnpike to meet this oncoming force, because for this period of military history, both in America and Europe, when armies were on the march, they were very vulnerable to attack from the side, from the flank, and being split in two or being cut off. So Meade, and of course Grant, was quite concerned that the Confederates were going to hit them as they were marching through the area like a long snake. They'd be thin somewhere in the middle, and that's what they were worried about. So Warren was turned west to move to Ewell's threat, and then eventually Sedgwick, we can see the Sixth Corps, once his men were across Germanna Ford, he moved down the Spotswood Road toward Warren's right flank to take up a position next to him. Well, what we had here was an open field, one of the few open areas in the wilderness, and you can see it on your map. I'll show you a picture in a second. You can see it on your map. It says Saunders Field, and that was an opening along the Orange Turnpike that the Union troops came out on, deployed, and saw that Ewell had taken up a position with his troops on both sides of the road. They had dug in, it was a higher ground, and that they were blocked, they were in the roadway, and a big threat to the Northern troops being able to proceed down towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. And you can see that on your map here. On the map there also, and I'll point it out on a second map later, the Wilderness Tavern is marked. Grant and Meade's headquarters were at that intersection of the Plank Road and the Turnpike, the Germanna Plank Road and the Turnpike. And Grant largely stayed to himself with Meade, but Meade was really the tactical person in charge of the Union battlefield. Now, at the same time that Ewell and Warren and later Sedgwick were starting to battle it out on the Orange Turnpike, Hill had come down east along the Orange Plank Road with his first two divisions, and he began to move past Parker's store, which you can see on the bottom of your map, and then you can see where he is advancing toward Hancock. Once he was spotted on the Orange Plank Road, Hancock would eventually turn his corps around and move back toward where Hill's advance was, so that he didn't get cut off, and so that he could keep the road network open for the rest of the army to eventually move down toward Spotsylvania. And you can see this fighting between the red figures, the red brigades under Lee, I'm sorry, A.P. Hill and Winfield Scott Hancock, all along the Orange Plank Road, where just before it intersects with a major road artery called the Brock Road. And you can see that happening there. Hill attacked the Union troops, very bloody fighting along in there. And one of the things that you can see in this map is that in the center of the map, where you see Wilcox and the red brigades that are outlined in red but not filled in, those troops were originally on the Tuning Farm, which is a pretty large clearing in this area that was a key open area. But when Hill attacked Hancock, those troops were moved out of that area and moved toward the attack along the Orange Plank Road, so that the fighting along the Orange Turnpike to the north and the Orange Plank Road to the south were in some ways two different engagements with a large gap in the middle. So again, this is still on the first day of the battle, May 5th. So let's go to the new slide, next slide, and you'll see a view today of Saunders Field. The road that you see on the left, you can see kind of a silver or white car there. That is the Orange Turnpike, and the federal troops were coming from the distance where the road goes into the woods. That's where they were coming out of. So we're looking at Saunders Field from the south side of the Turnpike at the edge of the Confederate lines. And you can see the tree rows, the forest, but it was a pretty open field. A lot of back and forth fighting in here. At one point, the Confederate line appeared to break south of the Turnpike, but they were able to stabilize it, and Warren was not able to make any more headway at this point. Okay, let's move on to the next map. Okay, so this is a map that was created much later after the battle was fought, but with the same road network and with a lot of detailed records. I can try to find a little bit more information for folks on these maps. These are all in a collection at the National Archives, available. At the Library of Congress, available online. The red brigades, of course, represent the South. The black, it looks like they were originally navy blue, but they look black on the map. Those are the Northern troops. And I'll point out a couple of things here. You can see kind of toward the top right, left, there's a star at the crossroads. That's where Grant and Meade's headquarters was. And you can see on the other side of the map, a little farther to the south, is a red star. And that is where Lee's headquarters was along the Orange Plank Road. He had made his headquarters with A.P. Hill's Corps. You can see on the left of this map, Ewell fighting Warren. Sedgwick had come in. This is the fighting at Saunders Field. Some of the troops down of A.P. Hill's were sent over to help on that road. And this is just prior to the attack against the Union position on Brock Road. And if you look on the right-hand side where it says kind of vertically Hancock, that is where Hancock's position was prior to getting notice that he needed to get back to the rest of the battlefield where the Union Army was threatened. Now, one of the things that Lee had achieved by this point is the fact that he had hit the flank of Grant's and Meade's Army of the Potomac as they marched square on the side, and he had reached his objective, which was to stop the Union progress, the Union Army progress, and to fight in the wilderness where the Union cavalry, Union artillery would not be as valuable because of the terrain. On this map also, you can see that Sedgwick is coming up on the upper left, and Burnside in the far left corner is just about to come across the river at Germanna Ford. Longstreet is to the south, still coming up on May 5th. He is a long way to go. His men are really pressing hard to meet up with the other two corps under Ewell and Hill, but won't get there until the next day. Okay, let's move to the next slide. And you can see on this one where Sedgwick joins the fight, Warren has been pushed back out of Saunders Field. Ewell is dug in along both sides of the road, and his division under Early on your left on this map is showing fighting against Sedgwick's advance. Now, again, this is very, very difficult terrain. There are few farms, few openings, few roads. So units would try to gauge where they were by the sound of gunfire and action. They would try to see who was to the left and who was to the right, but between black powder smoke and other impediments of the terrain, it was very difficult to manage. Where Warren is here on this map, along the Orange Turnpike, just below where the dark blue star is, where you kind of, if you can read that, it's Wadsworth's troops there, was what was called Ellsworth, which was the Lacey House. And that was in a fairly good sized clearing where troops could be marshaled and organized and hopefully put back in to the action again. But it was still very difficult terrain south of there. Ellsworth is part of the Park Service today. It has limited operating hours, but I want to point out that the house has been very nicely restored, and there's interpretation in there. So if you ever get by there, please do. And a lot of that is through the efforts of the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. On your right on this map, you can see Hancock starting to come up along the Brock Road to defend that key road from AP Hill. This is about 3:30 in the afternoon of May 5th. And you can also see at the top right that Burnside's 9th Corps is just starting to get across the Rapidan. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What happens here? Well, by about 4 p.m., most of Burnside's troops are across, but you can see that on Ewell's front, or the Union front under Warren and Sedgwick, they've really dug in, put some breastworks up where they could, or just dragging logs to prevent Confederate attacks and casualties. But they've really established a position here that stretches from the Germanna Plank Road through the woods near the Lacey House, south of the Lacey House, across the Turnpike and into the kind of the center of the battlefield. Whereas on the right of the Confederate line, Hancock's troops advanced against Hill's forces. So AP Hill had to take some troops out of the center of the line, where you see those thin lines that are representative of breastworks, and move them over to the Plank Road in order to defend that key terrain. And this area there, which we will have a picture of in a moment, is where the Widow Tap Farm is. And that's a very accessible place on the battlefield today. And it was at the same time, too, was an open farm, kind of a poorer kind of farm there. But this is still, again, on the morning of the 5th of the first day's fighting. So again, most of the fighting has shifted to the axis along the Orange Plank Road against Hancock's 2nd Corps. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is where things get very difficult for Lee, and the Union troops under Hancock had quite a large success. In the very early morning of the 6th, Hancock decided to attack Hill. Now, one thing that happened here is that AP Hill, because of the terrain and the nature of an attack, his troops were very disorganized. They were sleeping on the ground. A lot of them were mixed up with each other, couldn't find their leaders or their companies or their regiments. It was in the thick of the woods. They had little water, little food, and they had been marching all day, then fought for hours in the afternoon. And some of Hill's division commanders, particularly Harry Heath, wanted to spend some time that night getting rearranged, because they knew that Hancock was likely to attack in the morning. But Hill, several times, to his aggravation, eventually said, no, I'm going to let my men sleep. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the message. Well, that came to a tough break in the morning for them, because Hancock did attack, and the troops under the 3rd Corps of Hill were largely overwhelmed early in the morning and forced back down the Germanna Plank Road. And Lee tried to rally them and was unable to do so. The open area of the Tap Farm, which I'll show you in a second, was really at this point only defended by a battalion of artillery commanded by William T. Pogue, who was a volunteer Confederate from Lexington, Virginia. And he was able to hold off some of this attack, but just as things looked as bleak as possible, in kind of a Hollywood movie style where the cavalry rides in at the end, Longstreet's Corps, the First Corps, arrived on the battlefield along the plank road just in time to stem the Union attack. And his troops moved forward to the sound of the firing along the road and were able to stymie Hancock's attack, stabilize the line. And some of the first troops to come on the field, Lee rode over to them in a famous incident where he said, whose men are these? And they identified themselves as the Texas Brigade. And he prepared to lead them on horseback in a charge to push back the Union lines coming for them. And the men said, we will go forward, but Lee to the rear. And where that happens, where the arrow is, it's part of the Widow Tap Farm. Those of you who have been there remember the large Texas monument to that. And an earlier monument to that was financed as well by famous historian Douglas Southwell Freeman. So Longstreet arrived, and let's go to the next slide. And the next slide is an image which is going to show us in the background along that road in the far distance, that's where Longstreet's men came up along the plank road. And this area in here was where the Texans deployed and the Lee to the rear incident occurred. All right, let's go a little bit farther on our slides and we'll see what happens here. Longstreet, of course, you can see that big jumble in the middle and lower part of the map. I'm sure it was confusing. Again, on the right side of that road, that was all woods. They attacked Hancock, were very successful in pushing him back. Now they were trying to get, Longstreet and Hill were trying to capture the intersection of the Brock Road and the Plank Road, which if you see the map there, is just next to the H in the name Hancock. That's where they were aiming for. Burnside brought his troops up to kind of fill in the gap, but was really largely ineffective in being able to attack the Hill's left here. So the attack here had worked. It pushed Hancock back. And let's go to the next slide. You can see what that looks like. They had been able to stabilize this line here. Hill shifted Wilcox and Heath over to the middle. And this was the situation just before noon on the second day. But Longstreet received intelligence from his scouts and also soldiers from the Confederate Army who lived in this neighborhood, in this area of Spotsylvania and Orange County, that along an unfinished railroad that ran to the Union left, they could marshal some brigades and be able to attack the Union left. And that's what they did. You can see where I have that red arrow, the direction arrow. These brigades were led by G. Moxley Sorrell, who was one of Longstreet's staff officers. And he got 4 brigades on the Union left, unbeknownst to the Hancock or his subordinates, and attacked the Union left and was very successful. It routed part of the Union troops. They had to retreat back to the crossroads and the Brock Road. For a while, it looks like they would not be able to defend effectively against the oncoming troops. But as it turned out, they were able to do that. They were able to get along the Brock Road, and there were some defenses built, log and earthen defenses along the Brock Road, and they stood pretty well and prevented a complete rout of the army. Okay, let's go to our next slide. Now, one famous incident happened here is that Longstreet decided, and you can see here that the Confederates are slightly disorganized here after their attack, and that Hancock has fallen back. But where the arrow is pointing there, that is the general area where Longstreet was wounded. And it was eerily similar to Jackson being wounded, because Longstreet was wounded by his own troops, just like Jackson. And this area is not far from where Jackson's wound was at Chancellorsville. And it happened almost around the same time of the year, almost exactly on the same day. So Longstreet was withdrawn, severely wounded. He did eventually come back to the Army, but one of his staff members was killed, and it took a lot of the wind out of the attack here, so that it was difficult for the Confederates to fully capitalize on this flank attack that had worked so well from the Union left along the Underground Railroad, the unfinished railroad. Okay, so let's go one more slide here. On the other side of the field, late in the afternoon, early evening, the Confederates of Ewell's Second Corps were still along Saunders Field and the old Turnpike, the Orange Turnpike. And one of Ewell's brigade commanders, John B. Gordon, who was in Early's division, he discovered a fact that the Union right wing under Sedgwick was largely in the air. And what that meant in the 19th century was that they didn't really have solid defenses. Their flank wasn't anchored on a river or a natural obstacle, and that they could be turned. We can't go into all the details right now, but there was a lot of debate between Ewell, Early, and Gordon over whether it was too late to do this, whether Sedgwick's flank really was in the air. But by the time he got permission, it turned to attack with several other brigades. It turns out that Gordon was right, but he ran out of daylight and his attack kind of faltered after a while. But had they loaded up that left side, it is possible that Sedgwick's troops would have been in a lot of trouble. All right, one more slide, please. All right, so we're going to finish up with this one. This kind of shows the position of the armies at the end of May 6th. And the arrow that I hope you can see toward the bottom right is the direction that the Union Army moved off of towards Spotsylvania. And there was a race to Spotsylvania. That's another story. We won't get into it today. But Lee was able to block Meade and Grant from obtaining that key crossroad. But you can see how important the Brock Road was in order to be open and to get down there. That's why Longstreet's attack was so threatening to the Union position. The only other thing I'll mention before we get to some questions, if you have any, and again, you can use the question and answer function. This was a battle known where the wounded suffered horribly. A lot of the times between the black powder firing, cannon firing, these dry woods with lots of tinder caught on fire, and in many instances, the wounded could not be rescued in time before they were burned. Men remembered this for the rest of their lives, and there's lots of descriptives about this this battle and how terrible it was. But just to wrap it up, Meade and the Army of the Potomac shifted down to Spotsylvania. Lee and his army was able to beat them there, and the next battle along these lines and these roads and terrain between the Rappahannock and the Rapidan and Richmond was Spotsylvania Courthouse. Okay, so I am going to go to the Q&A and see what we have here. So we have a question about the heavily wooded terrain and how did that negate the Union superiority in artillery? Well, there was, that's a good question. There were openings again, around the Lacey House, Saunders Field, the Widow Tap Farm, where even though the Confederates were normally inferior in their artillery, both in the amount and the quality of their ammunition, that was one place where the Confederates were able to get together about 12 to 16 guns, depending on the time of the battle, and they were able to use it effectively. But other than down the roads and in cleared fields, it was very limited. We have another question on the number of troops engaged on each side. Lee had approximately 66,000 men, including Longstreet, when he came up on the second day. As a lot of you know, it's very difficult to, in some instances, to gauge Confederate numbers, losses, and that because of the records. But and then the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, had including Burnside, had approximately 118,000 men. Okay, let's go to another question. Let's see. The details of the wounding of Longstreet is a question. They were Longstreet and his staff were between the Confederates and the Union troops who were on the Brock Road. Not that long ago, probably within the last 20 years, the Park Service was able to add a small roadside stop on the tour with limited parking, some signage about the wounding. But it basically happened along the Plank Road between the Widow Tap Field, but much closer to the Brock Road. The Longstreet was out for a number of months. One of his best subordinates was killed, Micah Jenkins, and it was quite an interesting, difficult blow for Lee along those points. Okay, will there be a follow-on briefing about Spotsylvania? Well, it won't be part of Civil War week, I'm sorry to say, but we're always open to new ideas for programs, and hopefully we can do something along those lines. Let's see. Let me try to get to some more here. Who led the Texas Brigade and where were the units in the brigade from? I don't have the order of battle with me. I bet there's somebody listening right now who could add that to the Q&A or the chat for me that I would appreciate. And another question, Larry wants to know about Ambrose Burnside's performance and how did he get to be such a powerful political figure? Well, I'm not a Burnside expert, but Frank O'Reilly is, and so you will have the opportunity to hear Frank on Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. If you can't make that, we will be getting these programs available through our website that have been recorded. So hopefully that will help out there. Okay, another question is the Lacey House. The site is referred to as Elwood Manor. Right, at the time and on almost all the maps, you'll see it listed as the Lacey House. Friends of Wilderness Battlefield, I think I mistakenly said the trust, but yes, you're correct. The Friends of the Wilderness Battlefield provides a lot of interpretation to that site. They have interpretive programs. They even have some programs about Lafayette when he was in that area, both on his tour and as part of the 1781 Virginia campaign. So there's a lot going on during non-pandemic times, and I hope that group that I'm a big fan of can get back to the programming that they really do well. Okay, so how hard was it to retrieve the bodies of the dead after the battle with all of the tricky terrain? Well, a lot of the bodies, especially on the Union side, were buried on the spot. Some were eventually buried in various cemeteries across the wilderness area. eventually, because there was already a national, or there would be after the war, a national cemetery in Fredericksburg, rather than maintain separate cemeteries at the various battlefields in the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania area, the Union troops were moved. The casualties, the dead, were moved from their original cemeteries and burial places to the cemetery at Fredericksburg. In fact, one of the cemeteries, and I believe they were at least for the Wilderness, they were labeled as cemetery number 1, cemetery 2. I believe cemetery number 2 was actually close to the tour stop where the Longstreet Wounding is now interpreted. So that was where one of them. Okay, let's see if we got any others. I appreciate all these questions, and some of you, I'm sure, know quite a bit about this battle. I see Peter Kolakowski is asking about what made the battle a significant battle in the Overland campaign. Before we talk about that, I just want to mention that Peter Kolakowski's son, Chris Kolakowski, is giving a presentation for the museum May 4th on the Army in the Philippines. So we'll have more information about that later, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. I would think that the biggest impact of the Wilderness in the Overland campaign was Grant saw that Lee's army, though smaller, it was not going to be as easy to come through the Wilderness and eventually get to Richmond as possible. Now, I don't think Grant underestimated Lee, but I believe he possibly looked at his numbers as being more telling, and eventually they would be, among other reasons. But Grant also was able to see his commanders in action, his corps commanders, and he came away with less of an opinion of Burnside in this, but he was very favorable to Meade. And as we heard last night in the presentation by John Selby, Grant was very much in favor of keeping Meade as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. But I would say this was probably the beginning of his lessening appreciation of 5th Corps Commander General Warren. Warren was a little cantankerous. He impressed Grant as being slow, reluctant to attack head-on into enemy positions, kind of looking toward the flank. And as some of you know, by the time of the last several days in the war, Sheridan also had a very low opinion of Warren and actually relieved him at the Battle of Five Forks. But this really gave Grant an opportunity to see Lee's army, his army. And I'm going to paraphrase, and some of you probably know the exact quote, but Grant said something about that the Army of the Potomac generals had spent so much time worrying about Lee. Get back to your commands and figure out what we're going to do. And I think he was very frustrated with that. So we're going to try to wrap it up here. I know this is a lunchtime program, so I don't want to go over in case folks have to go. But let me just mention that we do have additional programming tomorrow at 10 a.m. We have a virtual field trip, which is going to be a CART program exploring the Civil War soldiers' load. In other words, what they carried, what they wore, including equipment, musket rifle, uniform, food, things along those lines. And we'll have that will be tomorrow at 10 a.m. coming to you from the museum. And we will also have a virtual book talk, an author presentation by Elizabeth Varon of University of Virginia. And she's going to focus on Grant. She's written 3 books now on Grant, and she's going to focus much more on the last year of the war and his philosophy of the war, what it was all about. So that's tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time as part of our Civil War Week. I want to thank all of you who came out for attending this. It's been a pleasure to present it. I hopefully have shown some images and maps that either you haven't seen or maybe are more explanatory than others. But thank you again, and please join us for additional programming the rest of the week. And with that, I will say thanks again and have a good day.